I'd like to introduce Abraham Newman, who is a researcher, I think technically in politics, but you have a topic that you've chosen for today that could be written in a number of different disciplines, I think, the title. And so that is the role that market power plays in global economic regulation. And so we're really, this is a topic that interests many of us, actually. And so we'll just hand over to you and let you take it away.
Great. Perfect. Well, thanks again for having me today, and I'm excited to share this work. I'm gonna share my screen so I can do my PowerPoints. Here we go. And I want to talk about two different papers that came out in 2019, and they both are focused on different kind of dimensions of what I think about new economic statecraft, or how governments are trying to shape global markets. And the first was really focused on market power. And here, I'm not thinking so much about firms' market power, but the state and the state's ability to use its market for influence. And the second is about weaponized interdependence, which is, I'll talk more about, but about how states use networks to shape global markets and global regulation. So, this group doesn't really need to be told that this is an important topic, but at least in political science, a lot of the focus has really been on trade and not regulation. And so I want to kind of shift the emphasis back to the topic of how non-tariff barriers or laws, then they really are a key part of kind of the global political economy and who influences them. The standard story in the literature is often focused on this race to the bottom, where jurisdictions pass low rules, and then when they have those lower standards, people then try to adjust to those. But there's this other literature about a race to the top, or the California effect, where people look for these higher standards and then they adopt those. Okay, so we have these kind of competing arguments about, do we get race to the bottom, race to the top, when does it happen? And a large question is, when can law reach beyond a state's borders, and when can it have an effect beyond just its national limits? And so people, talk about this as extraterritoriality. And so kind of a key question of my research is, when are states able to exert this kind of extraterritorial influence? And what are the conditions by which it has an effect? So you have these two kind of political science scholars, Beth Simmons and Dan Dresner, where they said, it's all about market power. It's like, large markets can force people to adjust. And so you're likely to get a California effect or a race to the top when a large market is putting pressure on other jurisdictions to do that. And so I think that's kind of the standard wisdom about when we could get this race to the top. But the puzzle is that in the US-EU relationship, you have two large markets. And so there's no clear expectation of who's going to adjust, what's going to happen in this kind of a setting. And moreover, you increasingly see that firms, they're the channel by which this type of adjustment happens. And you have large markets like China, they set standards, and then firms decide just to exit. So this is a picture of the death of Google in China. Everybody's so sad, they're putting flowers. But it does lead to this question of, okay, if large markets start to put pressure on adjustment, at what point do firms just say, well, we've had enough and we'll move on? So these are, as I think, a bunch of the questions that motivate my research about, if you have multiple large markets, they're making demands, when are you going to see adjustment to one standard versus the other? When are firms, who are really the kind of the targets of these pressures, when are they going to shift? And how can we think about this in a little bit more coherent way? So in the first paper that I want to talk about is really thinking about market power and moving to the level of the firm and thinking how firms might think about these types of pressures. And so they're often thinking about not just the market opportunity available in their home jurisdiction, so what business they can do there, but they also have to think about their rivals and the opportunities that they have there, as well as the assets that might be immobile. So if they've made fixed investments somewhere and they can't get them back, then they're worried about the rules that might apply to those, and they are going to likely have to adjust to those. I think the standard view is that we should think about the market in terms of its aggregate size. So, big markets in terms of money. And so firms will think about the costs and benefits of their home market and the target market based on this aggregate size. But that we know that this isn't enough to understand how markets work, because there's lots of large markets that don't have this type of global consequence. And so in this paper, the first paper I talk about, it's really focusing on how institutions are what mobilize markets to have this effect, this kind of externalization effect. You have cases where you have fragmented markets institutionally, even when there are large markets in terms of the aggregate size. And so an example of this is in the United States in insurance. Because of a quirk of legal development, insurance markets are regulated at the state level. And so even though you have a very large US market, there's no single regulator that oversees insurance. And because of that, it's very difficult to kind of aggregate that in a market power kind of way, because the market players are all thinking about this individual state by state level regulations, and therefore there's no one that can, the typical thing of like, who speaks for Europe? Well, in the United States on insurance, who speaks for the United States? And so in this paper, kind of the main focus is on the legal coverage of a market, that markets are embedded in law, and that the scope of that legal structure does not necessarily have to match the scope of the market. And so if you have fragmented institutions, the expectation is that then you have fragmented market power, because there's transaction costs across the subunits. They're not all the same. And you also need the regulatory capacity to control market access. And if the market access is decided at the subunit level, then you don't get the same kind of bang for your buck when you're making market access decisions. If a firm has to think about what's the regulation in Germany, what's the regulation in France, what's the across these different markets, then it's less likely to make decisions based on the EU-wide market. So similarly, if you don't have that centralized coordinating institutions, it's very difficult to participate in international negotiations on these issues. If you take the case of insurance, for example, it's a really good example where the United States has been pretty much blindsided in its ability to set global standards on insurance, because the main regulators, the state level units, are not the regulators that are present in global standard setting conversations. So if you think about the Basel Committee is made up of the central banks, but the Central Bank of the United States is not the primary regulator of the insurance market. And so what I'm trying to think about are the cases where there's a misfit between the market size and the institutional scope of regulation. And when there is that misfit, then we're likely to see like a suboptimal level of market power. Conversely, when you see a jurisdiction expand the scope of its regulatory domain, you should see an increase in market power. And so this is a kind of an example where I'm thinking about the legal rules and their scope and how they either fit or don't fit with the market size. And as that jurisdiction expands, we should see a higher compliance with their rules, and also that firms will see a greater benefit to meeting the standards of that jurisdiction. Okay, so this is just in the paper, we have a few expectations, is that firms facing adjustment pressure will be less likely to exit a rival state when their home market lacks a harmonized government structure. So if you don't have a common set of rules, then when there is adjustment from an external jurisdiction, you're probably gonna not focus on the home market because it's all fragmented, and you'll focus on this external market. Firms are more likely to exit when they face adjustment in a rival market if their home government creates a more efficient market through jurisdictional expansion. So if the jurisdiction in your home market increases and you face adjustment pressure abroad, then you're more likely to exit the market, and just because you have this larger market at home now with a common set of rules. I'm not going to get into this. This is a little bit more in the weeds, so I'll skip this. Is about we look also at the mobility of assets as another expectation in the paper. So how do we look at this empirically? We think about EU jurisdiction and its expansion in the financial services sector in the 1990s. And we think about how firms are delisting from the US stock market as the US government places increasing jurisdictional pressure on these companies. Probably, this is old hat to many of you, but in the 1990s, the EU enacted the Financial Services Action Plan. It was a major set of reforms to create a single market in finance. And one of the arguments or its perception was that it really was an effort to unify standards and regulation within the EU, and it would have global consequence. You have this quote from Peter Bodart, who was at the Bank of New York, about the importance of this in unifying standards in the EU. At the same time, the United States creates this typical type of adjustment pressure of what you would think would happen in a trading up context. It passes the Sarbanes-Oxley reforms in 2002. And these were a set of accounting standards reforms that were brought on by the Enron scandal, which was another whole nother story. But it created a lot more adjustment pressure for European firms because they couldn't just use their European accounting standards to meet these requirements if they were listed on the US stock exchange. And so this is kind of this example where we see a increase in jurisdictional expansion on the EU side. We see increased adjustment pressure being placed on these firms by the United States. And so we want to test, well, in this new environment where the European companies actually have a larger internal market legally in terms of jurisdiction, are they more likely to exit rather than adjust to the pressure placed by the United States? And so we have firm level data that we compiled from CompuStat, and we are looking, the unit of analysis is the firm year. I'm just going to quickly present the results. What we're looking at are firms that are incorporated in the EU, are they more likely to exit or delist from the US stock exchange rather than adjust? And in the period from 2002 to 2005, that is what we see. Here you see we have a whole bunch of controls, but if you're an EU company, you're more likely to delist than not. We contrast this with before Sarbanes-Oxley, so in the period from 1998 to 2001, and here you see that EU, if you're incorporated in the EU, it doesn't have that kind of delisting effect. And so once the US puts this pressure in this context of a larger jurisdiction, those companies are more likely to leave in the latter period than in the former. We also compare it to if you were incorporated in Japan or the UK, and here you see that there's no effect. Here are two large markets that didn't change their jurisdiction during this period, and you see the similar kind of consequence. Okay, that was just like running through that paper very quickly. We can talk about it more in Q&A. But I want to also move to another area of my research, which is with Henry Farrell at Johns Hopkins University on weaponized interdependence. And so this 2x2 just gives you a sense of different types of economic coercion that states engage in. And what I just looked at is kind of bilateral actions against economic actors, the market power box. And that's the traditional, you give access or deny access to your market to try to get people to adjust. What we're seeing increasingly is that states are leveraging the network, access to the network, in order to get states to adjust and their adversaries. And I just want to walk you through this argument very quickly. So, we all rely on global networks. This is no surprise, whether it's information or money or production networks. And the standard story is that these networks kind of reduce state power. This is back to the race to the bottom argument that, it's a web, not a wall, and that states are kind of neutered by these types of economic interactions. But that is not at least what we've been seeing recently. where you see, the wars between the United States and China by Trump, when you see the kind of the pressure on Iran. Recently, there's been economic conflict between Japan and South Korea. These are all examples where states are using economic networks, not just to decentralize power, but really to leverage power. So how is this happening? The fundamental argument that we make is that global networks are asymmetric, that they're not flat and decentralized in many cases, that there are nodes in these networks that are more important than other nodes. This map it's the map of the Delta Airlines flight, but you could choose any airline, it could be Lufthansa or British Airways. You see that there's a central hub here in Atlanta, and let's say you want to go from Bermuda to Cancun, somehow you have to fly through Atlanta to do that. And this seems like maybe an anodyne example of this process, but in the global economy, this type of centralization around key hub nodes happens in lots of different places. And so one of our arguments is that when you have these private actor networks that centralize exchange, that states now can leverage that to exert their power. And so in the paper, we look at how privileged states use these hubs for coercion to get at their adversaries. So they're trying to target another state. Let's say the United States is targeting Russia or Iran, but the way that they're doing that is through private actor networks and these hubs in those networks. And they do it through two ways. On the one hand, they do it through what we call the Panopticon Effect. And this is that they're monitoring, they get to see what's happening in the network. This is kind of the example of Jeremy Bentham's classic version of how you build a prison is you just need one guard if you put them as the central watchtower in a circular prison. And of course, Foucault built on this and said, this was a way that states exert power is they sit at the central position and monitor what's going on the outside. And here what's happening are states like the United States or the European Union or China sit at these hub positions in global networks, and then they can view what their adversaries are doing in them. The second way that states can exert power in these networks is through chokepoint effects, which is to cut off their adversaries from key exchange points. This is the bridge that connects Venezuela to Colombia. It's a very physical version of this issue, but increasingly we're seeing it in a virtual space where what governments do is they say, well, you can't have access to some critical global economic network, and then that has very devastating consequences for their firms because they no longer can participate in the global economy. I'm not going to go through the whole paper because I just am giving you a taster of this, but I wanted to kind of give you an example of one of the cases from it, which is about global finance and the role that this organization, SWIFT, plays in it. So I'm sure many of you know about this organization. It sits in Belgium, and it's kind of like a global post office for finance. If you're a bank or a stock market or an insurance company, you're using SWIFT to conduct your transactions with other financial players. Sorry, I just have this one slide. Usually I have a few more. But in the after the attacks of September 11th in 2001, the US government targeted SWIFT as a way to both get the Panopticon and the Chokepoint Effect moving. And in terms of, it started with terrorist organizations, but then it really moved to the Iran sanctions program, where first they used SWIFT in order to identify what terrorist organizations were doing in global finance. And then they started using SWIFT to disconnect Iranian banks from global networks. And what we explore in this paper is the way in which the network became the channel for US power, rather than just the national market, as you might think of in market power type arguments. So in both of these papers, we just briefly think about what does Brexit mean for economic statecraft. And the interesting thing is that in in many cases, it's an upside for the United States, is the kind of the takeaway, is that when you have this kind of devolution, both in terms of the market that's underneath the European jurisdiction, and as well as the fragmenting of global economic networks in Europe, it means that the United States kind of sits in a better position in its ability to leverage market power because its market size has remained the same, while the jurisdiction that's covering the European market has shrunk. And also, the financial networks that power Europe are now being fragmented as you see financial players leave the United Kingdom to go to a host of France, the Netherlands, and different actors. And so it's kind of an important point that we want to make in both papers, is that your ability to exert global regulatory influence is often determined by random domestic political events, or maybe not random, but by domestic political actions rather than the attempt to shape global regulation. Another example of this would be the Hong Kong crisis, where China would like to be a global player in both market power and also in weaponized interdependence, but it has a big concern about democratic freedoms in Hong Kong, and it's more interested in those domestic political consequences of democratic freedom than it really is thinking about its ability to shape global regulation. And so this, I think, a lot of, I would say, sometimes political scientists are saying, well, the rational thing to do is you should just increase your jurisdiction in order to combat other jurisdictions that might be pressuring you to adjust. But those institutional rules are often the product of long playing out political history rather than meeting the demand that you face at the moment globally. So let me just conclude by saying, regulatory politics in a multipolar world is quite complicated. And I think that we need more research to really think about the interactions. A lot of the initial arguments were very focused on kind of static models of like, you have a large market, you're the United States, you get to make people adjust. But increasingly, we see Europe, China, the United States, and other countries entering this regulatory competition, and we need to think a little bit more about what happens when there's many players. The second, which is a really important part of my work, has been thinking about the institutional components of economic coercion. So in the case of weaponized interdependence, for example, the United States has been a really important player, not just because of the shape of the global networks, but because it has institutions like OFAC, the Office for Foreign Asset Control, that allows it to leverage those networks in a targeted way to impose sanctions and export controls on other parties. One of the problems that Europe faces in leveraging these types of tools is that it doesn't have an OFAC comparable institution, and there's a lot of resistance within national member states to giving the EU that power because they want to keep it for themselves. The third point is, we do this more in the market power paper, but it is also really important for the weaponized interdependence argument, is that firms are really the channel through which these types of politics are playing out. And unfortunately, in political science, often the unit of analysis is the state. And so we really want, we're trying to push people to think about how do firms respond, and how can we model and think about their responses to these types of pressure. And then the final point is just, the interaction between deregulation and global influence, and how there was a long period of state building which built up regulatory capacity in many countries, and now we've seen that kind of slowly degrade, both through deregulation, but also kind of a longstanding war on expertise. And one of the arguments I think it's important to make in the United States is that the war on expertise and deregulation, it has global consequences. And as there are new powers emerging in this multipolar regulatory world, we need to guard those resources because they will implicate who sets the rules for the global economy. And with that, I will just say thank you, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Okay, thank you very much. That's really interesting thoughts here. I wonder if we're going to have some questions and comments from people, but before that, I wonder if you could just say a bit more about your asset movement point in the market power paper that you moved over very quickly, because I think it might be interesting to some of us.
Sure. So one of the things that we look at is, as a kind of intervening variable, is not all firms are the same. And so there are some firms that have more immobile assets in a jurisdiction, and that they're more likely to adjust rather than exit. And so one of the things we look at are basically, kind of like industrial fixed costs that companies have. And then we interact it with your location, whether you're an EU firm or not. And we find that those companies that have those immobile assets, even if they're European, they're more likely to stay rather than delist, because it's harder for them to, they would have to bear the costs of removing those fixed cost investments.
Okay. All right. I can't easily see people with their hands raised, but if anyone wants to come in, please feel free to unmute and start up. Well, maybe I'll start up with one point. I mean, obviously we're just coming off a very dramatic event from the UK perspective of in terms of regulatory change, which is Brexit. The one of the theories you were talking about would suggest that that should basically weaken the position, especially of the EU, with respect to negotiations with the US. But perhaps much less so for the EU. So you were talking about the fragmentation of the EU, but the EU is not losing that much of its economic weight. Still has a larger population than the US, but the UK is now entering a negotiation process where it's much smaller. What do you think are the implications of that?
Yeah. So I mean, one of the things that is important is that across these global economic networks, there's not one universal network. So there's these sub networks. And so in an area like trade, the EU, hasn't lost that much of its market. But in an area like finance, it's a really big blow to, I think, both parties, both the UK and the EU, in terms of their ability to negotiate with the United States. And in the work that we do on weaponized interdependence that Henry and I do, global finance has become the channel through which a lot of countries exert their regulatory power. And so, it's like, if you don't comply with our rules, you can't list on our stock exchange. Or if you don't comply with our rules, we'll sanction you and you won't have access to our banking system. And so as Europe kind of fragments in its financial, jurisdictional oversight, then that really, I think, weakens both parties quite tremendously, because the biggest market is in London, and but the rules are, being set in the EU. And even if you look at things like the Basel Committee, or the ability for the Bank of England and the ECB to work together in those kinds of settings was always a very powerful force in global standard setting, and that's kind of now fragmenting. So I think there's not one. There will be places where Europe is still fine. One of the places it's, I think, increasingly trying to exert its influences in digital spaces, and there, the UK is important, but it's not a dominant player. And so I think it won't be as affected. But I think we just have to be honest. Brexit is not a good thing for either the UK's global negotiating position or the EU's global negotiating position.
Elias, I think you have a point.
So thank you very much for this interesting talk. I have two questions, or perhaps three. So the first one is just an observation. So I'm very surprised how you define market power in this context, because it's very different from how economists think about market power in terms of the power of firms to raise prices above the competitive level. And I'm wondering if you're rather focusing on, so I have the sense you rather focus on the size of the market, so the critical regulatory mass of certain markets. And then the second point that I was wondering about is whether so your main explanatory variable is rather this critical mass, so the power of states, but to what extent does also the way how the legal rules are shaped and designed influence how those jurisdictions have a broader jurisdictional reach? So do you think that this matters at all? And the third question is, to what extent are your conclusions different from Bradford's recent study on the Brussels effect and how the European Union manages to actually export to some extent its regulatory philosophy beyond its borders and shape global markets?
I'm sorry, Elias, could you tell me the middle? There was the market power, the Brussels effect. What was the middle question? I should have taken closer.
To what extent? So you mostly focus on the size of the state or the jurisdiction, and to what extent does it matter?
The character of the rules. The character.
Yeah,
of
the
the
character
rules.
of the rules, but also the instruments. So let's say the European Union uses a lot of free trade agreements, for instance, to export its regulations, and to what extent does this matter?
Great. Okay. So first, I would say this term market power is not the same. I come from an international relations context, and in international relations, the question is, how can states have influence over other actors in the global economy? And one of the arguments that has developed is this idea of market power, which you may or may not. Chad Damrow had this argument, regulatory power Europe. It goes back a long ways, but the two original proponents were Beth Simmons and Dan Dresner. They had this argument about market power where they said it's not just states making direct conditionality, like in a trade agreement. It's not just saying like, if you want to trade with us, you have to adopt our rules, but that there are these passive adjustment impacts of national regulation. So, the United States adopts some new rule and other countries and firms adjust to those rules. David Vogel, he wrote in the 1990s, he called it the California effect. And so it was kind of before the Brussels effect, but it's the same idea. It's like California passed emission standards that were higher than the global kind of average. And because companies want access to the California market, what they did was not only did they meet California's rules, but they they pushed their home markets to adjust those rules because they didn't want their domestic competitors to have to meet lower standards. So if you were a big exporter to California, you basically told your German government, please adopt California's laws because we want to equalize the playing field in our, with our domestic competitors. So that kind of process has played out for a long time. And that's what this, in the international relations context, that's what they call market power is. When can a country externalize its rules globally through these adjustment pressures through firms? The question of the character of the rules, I think this matters a lot. And in my work, I've been very focused on the institutions that activate market power. And that's kind of the title of this paper, is mobilizing market power, is saying it's not enough just to have a big market, but you have to have the institutions, the expertise, and the capacity to activate those rules. And I had a piece a while ago, is called Micro Institutions, Macro Influence. And it was all about this, about saying that, you can't just have a big market. you also have to have the institutions that then mobilize it. In terms of the Brussels effect, I think it's basically a legal version of these arguments from political science. I think they're very compatible with each other. And so Anu, she draws on my work and I draw on hers. So I think they're very compatible with each other. I think the argument about market power is different than the network argument, the weaponized interdependence argument, because it's not about conditioning access to your market, it's conditioning access to the global networks. So what Europe does, let's say in data privacy, is it says, if you want to get data out of the EU, you have to meet our rules. What the United States is increasingly saying is, if you want access to the global financial system, you have to meet our rules. And that it puts the pressure on foreign firms. So it externalizes the cost of that pressure, because who has to pay the penalty now for, let's say, doing trades with China or Iran? It's Deutsche Bank. It's not the US banks, because what the US government is saying is, if Deutsche Bank, if you trade with Iran, we're going to sanction you. And so it's a very tricky way of externalizing these kinds of pressures, because in the Brussels effect or in market power, European firms are facing the brunt. It's like, if they don't get access to that data, or if they can't so anyway, it shifts who is the target of the pressure, the adjustment pressure.
Thanks a lot.
Can I call on people? I see Tim has a hand. Oh, you're muted. Sorry. I'm sorry, Tim. Oh, Tim. Hello. You're muted. Yeah.
Sorry, as ever. Digital.
Yeah, I do it all the time.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the paper too, but when you're talking about weaponized interdependence, then finance is a clear one, because in a sense, the power goes from the US government very clearly to the US financial players, through to, with huge sanctions, of course, dollar dominance and various other features of the financial market. And I was just wondering, when you get to other markets where US private networks have become incredibly powerful, and digital is the obvious one here, how much more complicated it gets. And I was sort of thinking, clearly the government has put pressure on some of the players to have backdoors into their networks to prevent end-to-end encryption, and therefore, exert, various power through, and for their good commercial reasons, the networks themselves are playing a more complicated game here altogether. And therefore, even though in principle, something like some aspects of digital might give the US ability to weaponize interdependence, it's far less straightforward than with finance.
Yeah, so like you said, I think there are these sub-networks in global economic networks, so they're not all the same. In the paper, we do explore the other case is digital, is information networks. And, I think what we argue is that the US government was very ready and has been using the Panopticon effect. And so the Snowden revelations really demonstrate the extent of the NSA's ability to tap into these central nodes in global information networks that really flow through US channels. So one example is Amazon Web Services. It's the kind of back-end service provider for any digital communication. 80% of global traffic uses Amazon Web Services. And so that's like a way that the NSA has, access to this type of information. Also just the physical layout of fiber optic cables. I have a different map, which I could show. It's from the Snowden documents, where it's remarkable how much of global traffic is channeled through US, these US hubs, because of the legacies of the the way it was rolled out. That said, the US has been very reluctant to use the Chokepoint effect to disconnect actors from the internet or for information flows. And we argue it's because of institutional and normative reasons, because of free speech arguments. It's been quite difficult for the US government to do that. And you see other countries, it's not that difficult. Like the Russian government is perfectly willing to disconnect actors from their domestic information traffic. So we do think that different networks come with different both network topographies where the asymmetries are, but also different states have different abilities to leverage those types of tools. The other thing I would say is that the big difference between finance and digital is that there might be new private actors that are reconfiguring the network. So as I said earlier, in finance, the US is really becoming more dominant in global financial networks because of Brexit and because of the Hong Kong crisis. But in digital technology, China is really emerging as a competitor and has in many cases, the cheapest and most effective technology. And so this is the 5G debate about, should Huawei be the provider of the next generation internet? And it's why the United States is so, let's say, like the hornet's nest has been whacked, because they know the power of controlling these networks, and they're very worried about having China be the provider, or Chinese companies, I should say, be the provider of these networks.
Yeah, thanks.
Just to follow on your choke point argument with respect to the U.S., I imagine that, well, one could think about TikTok and what the ultimate threats were with TikTok. And I would expect there was a choke point threat, basically, with TikTok in that debate. So that suggests there is some willingness to use it on occasion.
Yes, and I would even, I think it's a great point. And I think that's a third area, which is about global supply chains and investment. And so I think it would be hard for the United States to there's like the information communication, and then there's this question of who the owners are and who has the ability to invest in the country. And the United States is increasingly using choke points for exactly that. So there's been a series of blacklists that the US has placed on Chinese companies that have some relationship with the military, or that have a relationship with human rights abuses. And they're all, the US is trying to play these choke points on the supply chain side or on the investment side in order to limit the reach of Chinese companies in the United States and also globally.
And possibly the most interesting one, especially over the last few weeks with global shortages, is in terms of global supply chain ability to leverage, or inability, depending on who you are, is chip manufacturing. You're given
Yes.
the sort of massive position that TSMC has, and not only TSMC, but TSMC in Taiwan.
Yes,
You know,
and I mean, I had like a Twitter rage yesterday about that supply shortage is in part a result of US weaponized interdependence activity, because the United States put these export controls on SMIC, which is the Chinese main semiconductor producer. And as a result of that, companies have been hoarding semiconductors because they're worried about the supply, because SMIC, it's not a sophisticated producer of semiconductors, but they provide a lot of the kind of just average semiconductors that people use. It's not the high end things that TMIC can make, but it's and so that has put it's crunched the supply, but it's also created this hoarding demand. And so now we have this, where car manufacturers in the United States are furloughing workers because they can't get access to these chips, which was in part the product of US targeting Chinese technology. So it's a fascinating, very complicated, and I enjoy it. I don't want to be one of those workers in Detroit. That would be very sad. But as an academic, it's a very interesting thing to study.
In terms of the choke points, also, and the digital, it's worth thinking about the origins of the digital network, which part of it was to make sure it was a network that would be redundant to any kind of disappearance of nodes. So the U.S. knows that if it did use choke points to try to project influence overseas as opposed to control access to the U.S. itself, that projection of influence would probably not be successful just due to the very structure of the network. Is that a possible argument?
Well, it is possible, but I think one of the things that there's a story about that the internet is very decentralized and it was built to resist these types of shocks, whether it was like one node going out but in reality there are these central nodes that there's a very limited number of global fiber optic cables that do kind of undersea traffic. So there was a case, it was like 5 years ago, where a ship just ran over one of them that connected Europe and Africa, and basically all of Africa's internet went out. And it kind of demonstrates the limits to that line of argument that it's so decentralized. It's actually not that decentralized. I mean, we have 1 million devices that are communicating, and they're very decentralized. But there are these key nodes in the global information network. The other one are the platform companies. So Google, Amazon, Facebook, their market share, coming to like the firm market power argument, it centralizes data collection in an unfathomable way that is opposite this kind of notion that the internet is very decentralized. There's five companies know most of all of our data.
Okay.
Elias is back up.
Can I ask another question on the weaponized interdependence paper? So do you have a sense what an appropriate policy response would be in this respect? So we have at the European level now a discussion. I think the French are floating this idea of strategic autonomy. Nobody really knows what it means. Nobody really knows how much it costs. But do you think this might be an appropriate policy response to this greater interdependence and the weaponization of networks?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that there are a series of responses that are possible. I would say for the really the heyday of globalization, Europe, its primary strategy was to bandwagon with the United States and say, we share preferences, and we have a lot of firms that are integrated with each other, and so we'll just work as a team. And even in the original Iran sanctions, so from the 2010s, Europe and the United States, they use these tools together on Iran to get Iran to the negotiating table. So it's not that Europe has some deep-seated reluctance to use these tools, or what has changed is that the United States under Trump really had a set of preferences that were incompatible or were rubbing up against European preferences. And so the Europeans have woken up and said, ooh, maybe these are bad. Maybe the United States isn't always our friend, and our bandwagoning strategy is undermining our objectives. And so you see Macron's strategic autonomy kind of initiative. I think that the second thing that Europe could do instead of bandwagoning is to try to insulate itself from US influence. And there it's really to build alternative hubs, to have competitor hubs to US efforts. But I think that there's a big challenge here, which is, on the one hand, Brexit really undermines that ability. But the other is that the alternative party in the world right now is China. And what you're seeing in many of these debates is a return to like a League of Democracies kind of argument, where democracies really need to cooperate with each other on these economic actions because they're worried about what happens if they get in bed with China. And whether it's in Berlin or in Paris or in London, the leadership is all really concerned about which way to go in this kind of changing world. The third thing that Europe is trying to do is build European institutions that could offer an alternative. And so the Commission had a report on the euro recently that was an effort to expand its international position. The Commission and the ECB had long been reluctant to push the euro as a reserve currency globally, because it felt like it would lose control over monetary policy. And this document is the opposite of that. It's saying the EU needs an independent euro. It promotes a digital euro. It does all of these things, and it's very much with weaponized interdependence in its headlights. It's thinking about, what are the institutions that we need? That all said, I think the biggest problem that Europe faces is that national governments don't want to cede this authority to the EU level. And so that's the first paper I showed, was that you often have national jurisdictions in Europe that are fragmenting this really big market. And so because of that, the private actors do not really have a coherent single network legally, because they have to face these different jurisdictions. And so you don't have an OFAC-like institution, an Office of Foreign Asset Control. You don't have sanctions authority that's really delegated to the European level. You just saw recently the Russia sanctions in Europe and how difficult it is for them to speak with one page, from one page. So I think that, Europe often would like to challenge the US in these areas, but there are domestic political constraints, both political and institutional, that, hinder this policy response.
Thank you.
Well, with that, Abraham, I think we might draw this seminar to a close unless nobody speaks up. I can't see hands, so you'd either have to speak up or we're going to close out. But I'd like to really thank you very much and give you a big virtual clap for bringing this new concept of market power to our audience, because we're used to thinking of the firm-specific focus of market power, and you're raising this idea that from the political science, international relations, of much more of you could think of it as an international bargaining power, or of a ability to project influence, which comes from size, and also influence over networks. And so it's really been eye-opening for us. So thank you very much, Abraham.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. I really appreciate the invitation, and look forward to continuing the conversation.